Right here, right now. Bill Martinez.
I'll tell you, you really are closer than you think you are. You just haven't seen it yet, and it's all coming to a head. And in this next couple of segments here with my dear friend, Bill Salus, Bill and I go back a long ways. He knew me and mentored me and taught me so much about the prophetic realm. It was something of interest that I guess I innately was drawn to. But Bill was so much further down the road, and it was such a blessing to meet him. In fact, he was one of my early guests when I first returned to the microphone some 12 years ago. And he's just been a dear friend. And meanwhile, he has continued to expand and grow his ministry in a dramatic way to where he has become the go-to person when we're talking about prophecy. People know him. His expository on Psalm 83 opened so many eyes. People that I highly respected over the years, when they read Bill's exposition on Psalm 83, they just couldn't believe that they had missed it. But it is the nature of prophecy. We know in part, we prophesy in part, and it's as if we're in an onion skin experience where God is drawing that back. Bill, I just want to say hi. I've got another intro here to kind of set us up to the conversation, but I did want to give people a little background to our relationship and why number one, you're so highly respected as a prophecy expert, and our relationship.
Bill, well, thank you so much for that. I do value our relationship, and I look forward to our time together today to talk about the prophecies that seem to be setting up right now.
Well, exactly, because less people forget, and they hear from time to time, yes, we talk about political issues, and we talk about what's happening in the culture, but God is still in control. I mean, fret you not that God has, as the song would say, the whole world in his hands, although there has been a concerted movement to think not the case. But we see the Middle East is erupting while the COVID-19 pandemic is disrupting life throughout the world. The Mideast is erupting before our very eyes. Since June 25th, Iran has experienced a series of 9 mysterious explosions, and a couple of them have been dangerously close to their nuclear facilities. Were you aware of that? Israel continues to levy strategic airstrikes into Syria and the Gaza Strip. Were you aware of that? And more recently, the Israeli Defense Forces have heavily intensified their military presence on Israel's northern border with Lebanon. And then on August the 4th, a massive explosion rocked Beirut's major port, killing an estimated 150 and injuring about 5,000. Is this the stage now being set for ancient biblical prophecies to roll off the parchments and pound down on the world's pavement? That's the question. And if so, could this lead to an even greater shaking in America? Well, let's find out. Bill Salus, the best-selling author, is with us, and we're going to be talking about his timely DVD entitled The Prophetic MidEast Wars, subtitled America plus Israel versus Russia plus Iran. Bill, take it from here. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Bill, that was really a great build-up to the show because the focus has been primarily on the mainstream media on COVID-19, and rightfully so. The pandemic is a really, really big deal. But look what's going on right now in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. The spotlights are starting to turn more and more in that direction. And there are biblical prophecies that we need to talk about and make your listeners aware of, dealing with Iran and Syria and Hezbollah and Hamas and these types of things. And even just recently, yesterday, a supposed historic peace deal was struck between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. So we're starting to see a real shift in the media going toward the Middle East now. And I know there's going to come a time, probably the time drawing very near, right, where God is going to take the spotlights and move them in the focus point of the Middle East.
Bill, can I ask you real quick before you continue regarding this peace deal with Arab Emirates? A little bit different than the peace deal that was proposed earlier in the year with the Palestinians. One more time, right? I mean, although it is significant, but I don't think it's intrusive in a traditional way where there is an exchange for land for peace. Am I misreading something here?
No, it's not a land for peace deal. This is part of leg one of Donald Trump's deal of the century. It was sort of a economic and political attributes, two legs to it, and he introduced the economic aspect in Manama Moraine in June of 2019. The UAE is the second wealthiest country in the Middle East behind Saudi Arabia, and they're very interested in having a relationship with America. They're interested in being part of that financial aspect of the economic aspect of the deal of the century. They're interested in us protecting them from Iran because they've got they're ranked number 45 among world armies. So they really need, this deal is more lucrative to them economically and militarily than it is, plus they're investing billions of dollars into Israel if this comes together to get their hands on the coronavirus that they're hoping Israel will come up with. Exactly. They've had about 64,000 of their 9 to 10 million population infected by COVID-19. So they've got their own different diverse reasons for being involved in this. But remember, they're not in UAE is probably not involved in any biblical prophecy, so we don't technically know what their future is going to be. They've never really been Israel's historic enemy. They were pretty much founded as a UAE in 1971. So, we'll see what happens, but at this point they're holding this up as if it's a historic peace deal, and it's probably going to infuriate Israel's enemies more.
I would think so. Yeah, but I want people to understand the exchange, land for peace and what that traditionally has done, and the consequence that America has paid when they have violated God's foreign policy and have put any pressure on Israel to exchange land for peace. We had a little bit of that, in essence, at the turn of the year, and some are saying, Bill Koenig, our good friend, yesterday reported that that movement was right at the doorway of COVID-19, and that quite possibly you could associate a consequence that America and the world is paying because, once again, we've taken God's holy land and think we can negotiate on his behalf, and God is real clear that he's not going to give up his land to anybody else. That belongs solely to Israel.
And, Bill, on a side note to that, not just the land for peace and how it could affect America, but also Israel prime ministers have a history of when they concede and appease, they've had some issues there. So, for instance, let's look in Rabin, when he put together his peace deal, the prime minister of Israel, he was assassinated in November of 1995. Not a good thing for him.
Right.
Ariel Sharon, prime minister at the time of George W. Bush, they vacated the Gaza. His arm was twisted, kind of like what I think Trump's doing with Benjamin Netanyahu. And the Hamas won the elections in 2006, shortly after the vacating of the Gaza. Sharon went to coma in January of 2006, just prior to the Hamas win of the elections. He died 8 years later in 2014, and then Ehud Olmert, and prime minister between 2006 and 2009, he was imprisoned for breach of trust and tax evasion. And remember, Netanyahu's got
his own problems too. Exactly.
Him right now. So I'm not trying to make a big case for this, but if I was Netanyahu now, I'd be a little concerned at this time on the timeline with any kind of things he's doing right now, trusting more in Trump than he is in the God of Israel.
Well, and that was my question to Bill yesterday, is that you would think with all this empirical evidence in history, and you and I have discussed this as well, he and John McTiernan have written extensively on this, cited something like 127 incidences when America intercedes or interferes, I should say, with God's foreign policy and God's assignment of the promised land to Israel within 24 hours of any kind of pressure on Israel to violate that promise and that covenant promise between God and Israel. The United States is hit with a natural disaster. I mean, to the tune, if you total them up, well over $1 trillion in damage, Bill. You would think that this isn't anecdotal. I mean, there is empirical evidence to this. I would think that if you're Benjamin Netanyahu or any leader of Israel or even any leader in the Oval Office, that you would take a look at the empirical evidence, right?
Absolutely. And in the process of this rank...
Got to go to break. More from...
Values, faith, service. They still exist here. Bill Martinez, live.
Hey, we're back with you, and we've got lots to cover with my good friend Bill Salus, best-selling author, renowned prophecy expert. Bill, real quick before we pick up where we left off, congratulations on the DVD series. I want you to direct our audience to where they can get their hands. I mean, wow, this is awesome. And when you and I first met, you were writing books. Now you're so multimedia with all that you're doing, and these DVDs are excellent. The Prophetic MidEast Wars, America plus Israel versus Russia plus Iran. We're going to touch a little bit on that in just a moment. The Now Prophecies, Disaster in Iran, Destruction of Damascus, Decline of America, the Final Arab-Israeli War. The Next Prophecies, you talk about Psalm 83, Ezekiel 38, Mystery Babylon, the pre-trib time gap, and the Last Prophecies, the prophecies in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. These dynamic DVDs are available at your website, correct?
Absolutely. That's Prophecy Depot, like Home Depot, prophecydepot.com. And just a little something on the latest one, the Prophetic MidEast Wars. It's so timely, Bill, and we'll conclude this next short segment with talking about some of the prophecies on the DVD. Because, like I said at the beginning of the program, the focal point now is going to shift more and more toward the Middle East, because these prophecies are about to roll off their parchments, like you said in the intro. And we've got Iran, we got Syria's involved, we got Hezbollah, Iran's proxies, so on and so forth. And actually, we've got to conclude the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it's not going to end diplomatically; it's going to be militarily, according to prophecy.
Right. Yeah, so no matter what Jared Kushner, President Trump, Netanyahu would want to do, that's not the way it's supposed to end. I mean, in a sense, they're kind of putting a Band-Aid on a serious wound here.
Well, it's interesting because they just came out with this peace deal, historic peace deal with UAE and Israel, and on the one of the statements that Trump has made is the problems of the Middle East can only be solved when all religions come together, and they're calling it the Abraham Accord. Mm-hmm. Going back to the patriarch Abraham, who was the father of the Ishmael, who was the father of the Arabs, and of course, Jacob goes on through the Israel, the descendants of Israel, 12 tribes of Israel. So he's under the illusion that they're going to be able to broker peace by uniting the three different faiths of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and that's not how it turns out in the end story.
No. So, we know who brings it all together, and it's not one Donald Trump. It would be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords who does that.
Right, and so we see the Israeli Defense Forces in numerous Bible prophecies defending the nation before the tribulation period, because they're not in that fighting mode during that last 7-year tribulation period. So we have to think, are we getting close to that time, the very time of the end, the 7-year tribulation? And if we are, what are the prophecies that have to happen pre that period? And there's a whole bunch of them, Bill.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go right down. Let's start with Iran, that elephant in the room that we mentioned.
Well, they are. There's a big deal right now. They're working on their nuclear program. There's been those mysterious explosions you talked about at the intro, 9 of them since June 25th. Israel's got plausible deniability all over that. Everyone pretty much understands it's likely been Israel involved in that, and maybe even America. Iran is in strong relationships with Russia, trying to build 2 more nuclear facilities in the Bushehr region, which is where the subject of a prophecy is in ancient Elam. When you look at a modern-day map of Iran, you have Persia, and Elam hugs the Persian Gulf. Mm-hmm. And both places, territories are subject to Bible prophecies, and it says, in the latter days. So the one I'm watching for right now, your listeners can go to Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it seems to be talking about a nuclear disaster that creates a humanitarian crisis in that region, where there's going to be, by 2026, 3 nuclear reactors built on where three tectonic plates converge. Terrible place to build them.
Right.
One of them already exists now, Bashar 1, but Russia's helping them build Bashar 2 and Bashar 3. Now that then is going to probably happen, and it's going to provoke Iran, who's ranked number 14 among world armies, who has, not including their proxies of Hezbollah, with 150,000 missiles pointed at Israel, some of them precision-guided. Syria is another proxy with Bashar al-Assad. He used chemical weapons over 300 times in his revolution. You got the Hamas, who continues to lob missiles into Israel. Estimates are, if Iran calls on their proxies to fight against Israel, that 1,000 missiles a day could come from Hamas, from the south in the Gaza area, and 1,000 could come a day from Hezbollah, and those are much more advanced and more pinpoint accuracy. Now, Israel can't withstand that kind of a hit. And we find at some point they actually destroy the city of Damascus in what we would say is a all-out prison rules war, and that's in Isaiah 17. So, I mean, these are all on the DVD bill. We go through these one by one. We have PowerPoint slides, teaching, maps, lines of force, and explain to people, walk them through how these things could sequence themselves and change. They're globally impacting, Bill. They'll change the world.
Right. Well, we've been seeing the destruction of Damascus over the years here, and and I keep thinking, when will Damascus be no more? But as you point out, there's more yet to come. Damascus is not annihilated to the point, or as the Bible would describe that it would be, right?
No, it's not, and it's not because of the Syrian Revolution that Damascus ultimately gets destroyed. Isaiah 17 is where the listeners would turn their attention. Verse 1 says that Damascus will cease to be a city. It will be a ruinous heap. It will be reduced to rubble. It is the longest standing. Its capital is Syria, and it's the longest populated city in man's history. It goes back to the time of Abraham, and it's going to be destroyed. But we're told in Isaiah 17:9 that it happens by the desolation is caused by the children of Israel, not by the Syrian Revolution. And it happens overnight, we're told, and as Isaiah concludes, he says, one night you see Damascus, or see him in the masculine pronoun, in the morning he is no more. And Israel has that capability with the strategic nuclear weapon, their worst-kept secrets, their nuclear weapons, to destroy a city. And they're going to find themselves in a real predicament where they really have to. Because inside of the prophecy, we also find out that Israel takes a hit. They can't withstand the barrage that Iran and the proxies, if that's what provokes the destruction of Damascus, they can't stand that barrage to come against them. And it looks like they get hit real hard, according to things they put forward on the DVD in that Isaiah 17 prophecy, Bill.
Right. And, of course, that leads us into Psalm 83, does it not?
Well, it does, because if Israel takes out a major Arab city, the other Arab countries, like we say, what's going to happen next to Beirut, to Amman, Jordan, to Cairo, to Mecca, etc. They would be legitimately concerned if they can take out Damascus. They can certainly take us out. One nuclear weapon would do the trick, and they would say, "Look, Israel is on its knees now. They've been hurt. They've been hit." And we don't want to be the next victim. Turns out there will be another victim, and that's in Psalm 83, and that's Jordan. Amman, Jordan actually gets toppled, and Israel takes over territory. There I get into those verses. But so they're justified in their concerns about that, and that ultimately, I do believe, comes into that final Arab-Israeli conflict spoken about in Psalm 83, 3,000-year-old prophecy, Bill, that talks about those nations that surround Israel. It actually came against them in 1948, but it didn't finally fulfill the prophecy. And they come in a final attempt, and Israel wins. And that's where we find out in many verses, related verses, that the Israeli Defense Forces today exist in fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
Right. Well, didn't we get a little bit of additional preview of it in the Six-Day War?
We did, and that's one of the reasons we know that prophecy didn't find final fulfillment, because when it finds final fulfillment, Psalm 83, they're no longer going to oppress the Arabs are no longer going to oppress the Jews. The Jews will win handily, but no, they reared their ugly heads up again. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in 1967, and then they came back again and tried to ambush Israel in 1973. Jordan was sort of dragged into that, but Egypt and Syria were there, and Syria still is actively at war with Israel. They never got involved in any fragile peace deal like Egypt and Jordan has, and those are fragile. There's prophecies that show that that, like I said, Amman, Jordan will be toppled. Egypt will get into war again with Israel. They've all got to somehow dovetail back into the major war prophecy of Psalm 83.
Mm-hmm. What people need to appreciate here, of course, it's their choice to do this, but God, again, in his character is so exact. I mean, this isn't some theoretical process. I mean, as I said earlier, with prophecy, we know in part, we prophesy in part. It's an onion skin experience. It's like when we're supposed to know these things, it's like when God revealed Psalm 83 to you. I mean, this was a light bulb moment, not only for you, but for other expositors and other prophetic experts that said, how did we miss this? And this really threw you center stage in the prophetic realm, Bill, was how God used you to and revealed to you Psalm 83. And again, it reinforces God's, his batting average. I mean, we've got about 2/3, as we say, 2/3 of prophecy has been fulfilled to the iota, and with a third remaining, I put out there to people, I say, what do you think the chances are that God's going to maintain his same batting average? If he's performed at this level with 2/3, what do you think the chances of the final third being performed exactly as he stated it will be done?
Well, that's right. He bats 1,000%. And the problem, Bill, with what we're talking about here is that if we're as far down the road on the end times line that we think we are, this starts exploding in the Middle East and gets globally impacting throughout the world, and we get into judgments in the tribulation where God pours his wrath out on a Christ-rejecting world. And in these books and DVDs, I'm trying to warn people about these things and how to prepare for them and how to evangelize through them.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're a watchman, Bill. I mean, this is what God has called you to do. He's giving you the responsibility of this revelation to put the word out there, and your ministry has been faithful to that end. And we're grateful for you and your faithfulness to that end, and in doing what God has called you to do. Again, remind people how they can be in touch and access your DVDs.
Yes, prophecydepot.com, Prophecy Depot like HomeDepot.com, and the DVD that you want to get your hands on, the latest one, is called the